You're listening to Himalayan Adventure by Vaile. Chapter 16.
The morning sun had fully risen by the time the truck rumbled past the first stone buildings on the outskirts of Shabrubesi. It was an isolated little village sitting in a small valley and surrounded by snow-capped mountains on all sides. Sitting snugly in the valley, it was protected from the cold winds that tore through the Himalayas, but it was also the last place to feel the warmth of the morning sun. Burnmaster rubbed his tired eyes and leaned over the side of the truck to get a better look. Several years had passed since he had last come through this region of Nepal, but as far as he could tell, not much had changed. An assortment of old stone and wooden buildings were clustered together along the main road, mostly shops and hotels. He recognized two of the hotels he had stayed at in past trips, one called the Tibet and another called the Buddha. There were more shops than he remembered, and more people moving around on the footpaths. Business at the moment must be good. There were few cars. The local Nepalese walked or rode donkeys. The village had a timeless quality to it, as though its isolation in the mountains had somehow frozen it in time. Burnmaster remembered its people as open and friendly, and judging by the bemused but welcoming smiles of the local people who looked at the truck with its motley collection of passengers, nothing had changed. Flattop craned his bull neck around and viewed Shabrubesi with a colder, more strategic eye. He didn't notice the locals' smiles, but he did see that the village was out in the open and vulnerable to attack from all sides. Other than the huge mountains in the distance, there were no natural defenses, meaning the place was an easy target for a North Korean assault force if the circumstances ever required a full frontal attack. The heavy stone buildings were good defensive positions, but the wooden buildings were highly flammable and would offer little protection against high-powered weapons. This rapid assessment raced through Flattop's military mind without any conscious effort. His masters back in North Korea had trained him to view the world and everything in it through the crosshairs of a gun's sight, and it was a habit that was difficult to break. Not that he wanted to. His brothers were starting to question everything their masters had told them, but Flattop wasn't plagued by such silly doubts. He was a soldier in the North Korean military, and his job was to follow orders. It was as simple as that. Second-guessing everything he was told to do and thinking about things in terms of right and wrong was such a waste of time. It was far easier to just aim and pull the trigger. The truck stopped in the middle of the village. Isabelle woke up and discovered that her head was resting against Flattop's arm, which was about as comfortable to sleep against as a steel girder. She jerked back and looked up at him to see if he had noticed. He stared down at her with unfriendly eyes. She muttered an apology, and he just opened his jaws and yawned, revealing black gums inside a mouth as big as a lion's. Gulbenkian helped the 14-year-olds out of the back of the truck and handed down their rucksacks. Laheeti and Twig had managed to get an hour of shut-eye during the cold and bumpy journey to Shabrubesi, but they were still tired. Twig ran his gaze along the buildings lining the street and was pretty sure that a couple of them were hotels. Which was good, because what he wanted right now was a hot shower and a soft bed to sleep in for the next 12 hours. Laheeti looked up over the tops of the buildings at the huge snow-capped mountains that surrounded Shabrubesi. As the young prince of the Vavu Islands, he'd had the opportunity to travel to many foreign countries, but this was definitely the most remote location he had ever been to. And things were about to get a lot more remote, because if they couldn't locate Nicky Zipster at Shabrubesi, their next stop would probably be one of those distant, icy peaks. After Mohawk and Maine jumped off the back of the truck, they glanced around the village briefly, then stared at the distant mountains in silence. Both of them were struck by the majesty of the Himalayas all around them. The locals stopped in the middle of the footpath and stared up at the silver-haired giants. The GXs stared at the mountains and the locals stared at the GXs. Isabelle giggled when she saw what was happening. She glanced at Flattop to see what he was doing and saw that he wasn't at all interested in the mountains or the locals. He was peering through the windows of the nearest building, looking for something. Isabelle recalled that he had said that he wanted to find Nicky Zipster, but surely that search could wait until after they had all found a hotel. Frowning, she watched him for a bit longer and suddenly realized that in some way she couldn't exactly describe, he was different to Maine and Mohawk. And it wasn't a good kind of different. Pemba thanked the truck driver for his help, then came over and stood with Isabelle, Laheeti, and Twig. Isabelle watched the truck rumble down the street, belching black exhaust fumes into the cold mountain air. "Do you think we're going to find Nicky here?" she asked. If she is here, it won't take very long to find her, said Twig as he looked up and down the street. This place isn't very big, he added. Isabelle nodded and replied, yeah, I was expecting it to be bigger. Me too, said Twig. The trail head to all the treks in Langtang National Park, that's how Burnmaster described it. It sounded more important than it looks. I think it's the national park that's important, not the village, said Laheeti. True, replied Twig. Anyway, there are other towns nearby. If Nikki's not here, maybe we can look in those places. And if she's not there, said Isabelle, I wonder if the next stop will be one of those mountains in the distance. After the landslide we just narrowly escaped, I'm not sure I want to go up there, admitted Twig. Pemba, whose secret responsibility was to ensure that Burnmaster and his companions departed from Nepal safely, and without finding one single trace of a yeti, took the opportunity to discourage the 14-year-olds from any journey into the mountains. I agree, he said. That landslide was a close call, and one near-death experience per year is my limit. I think it might be a better idea just to stay down here, where it's safe. Isabelle ignored Pemba because she knew he was anti-yeti, so his opinion on any matter related to the search for the yeti didn't count. Turning to Twig, she said, You mean you're going to let one little landslide put you off starting the real adventure of this trip? Twig frowned. What do you mean, the real adventure? He asked. Wasn't going to Kathmandu exciting enough for you? Sure, if your idea of an adventure is staying in hotels and visiting universities, Isabelle exclaimed. What about when those goons in Kathmandu held us at knife point and tried to steal our gear? Twig said. That wasn't exciting enough. Isabelle laughed. Scary is more like it, she replied. Exciting? No, and certainly not an adventure. As far as I am concerned, the adventure starts when we set foot in those mountains. And as far as I am concerned, that's when my responsibility of keeping you all safe gets a lot harder, thought Pemba unhappily. He was glad that Zaw and Abby were working with him on this job, because it would take the efforts of all three of them to keep Isabelle and her friends out of trouble. Pemba was pretty sure that Burnmaster could handle himself in the mountains, but Isabelle and her friends were amateur trekkers. They had all the right gear, and after seeing how they handled the killer landslide situation, he was sure they had the courage, but they had never had to survive for an extended period of time in an environment as rugged and unforgiving as the Himalayas. Yes, if this little party headed into Langtang National Park, he would definitely need the help of Zaw and Abby. He glanced down the main street and wondered how far away from Shabrubesi his yeti friends were. Hopefully they would be there by sunset. Pemba tuned back into what the 14-year-olds were talking about. So there's no question about whether we'll be going into the mountains, Isabelle said. The real issue is what kind of traps we'll use to capture a yeti when we get there. You're planning on setting traps to catch a yeti? Asked Pemba skeptically. Aren't they supposed to be as big as gorillas? I thought you didn't even believe in yetis, said Isabelle, but now you're suddenly full of theories about how big they are. I'm just saying that if they are real, they might be big, so the idea of trying to set a trap for one seems a bit misguided, Pemba muttered. So we'll have to use very strong traps, Isabelle declared. There's not much point talking about catching a yeti at the moment because the first thing we have to do is find Nikki Zipster, said Twig. That's what brought us to Shabrubesi in the first place. That's right, agreed Laheeti. No Nikki Zipster means no abominable snowman. Twigger glanced over at Burnmaster and Gulbenkian, who were standing about a dozen paces away. We should probably keep our voices down about Nikki Zipster, he said. I think Burnmaster is really worried about her and we should be a bit, sensitive. She might really be in a lot of trouble. I agree, added Laheeti. And we should probably keep the yeti talk to a minimum too. Our first priority is to find Nikki. And he almost added, or find out what happened to her, but he caught the words before they slipped out of his mouth. It didn't seem right to talk about Nikki as though she had come to a grisly end. All they knew was that she was missing. It was entirely possible that they would discover her staying in a hotel there in Shabrubesi before nightfall, provided they could stay awake that long. When Burnmaster and Gulbenkian came over, the conversation about Nikki and yetis grew silent. Burnmaster said that there was a hotel up the street that had been good a few years ago. Everybody agreed to follow his recommendation, and after hefting their packs onto their shoulders, the group meandered along the street towards the hotel. Burnmaster stole a glance at the three Koreans, who had moved to the other side of the street. Flat Top was staring in the windows of one of the shops, and Mohawk and Maine were standing nearby in quiet conversation. Whatever their brother was looking for, they didn't seem too concerned to help him find it. Burnmaster hoped that the silver-haired giants would lose interest in traveling with him for a number of reasons, not the least of which was that he didn't trust them. so he was disappointed when he saw them drift across the road and strike up a conversation with Pemba and Twigger. "Are you all looking for a hotel?" asked Flattop, matching his stride with Pemba. "Yes," the Nepalese boy replied. "Burnmaster knows a good one. I think we'll tag along for a while like we talked about back at the landslide," Flattop said. His unblinking black eyes stared at Pemba. "You're a local, right?" he asked. Pemba nodded. "That's good, that's really good," said Flattop, and his mouth creased into the shape of a smile, but there was no friendliness in his eyes. Isabelle, Laheeti, and Gulbenkian drifted to the back of the group. The royal bodyguard had so far said nothing about the three silver-haired giants, and Isabelle wondered if he was unhappy that they had joined the group. It was hard to tell with Gull, he always had a smile on his face, but she had known him for a while, so she knew when he had something on his mind. Mohawk, Mane, and Flattop were about a dozen long strides ahead and, by Isabelle's estimation, out of earshot. "Have you had a chance to talk to our new friends?" she asked Gull. "A little bit," stammered Gull. "I talked to Flattop for a while in the truck when you were asleep. He's a strange man, hard to talk to. Doesn't seem to know how to make conversation. Maybe he's just shy," suggested Laheeti. There was a lot that Isabelle didn't know about Mohawk, Mane, and Flattop, starting with the most fundamental piece of information about them. They weren't entirely human. A number of their physical abilities had been enhanced through the inclusion of some key elements of the DNA from a huge silverback gorilla, and as a result of that genetic engineering, the GXs had the highly sensitive, almost superhuman hearing that gorillas use to stay alive in the jungles of Africa. Right now, it meant the GXs heard every word that Isabelle, Laheeti, and Gull just said, even though there was a big distance between them. Flattop exchanged a glance with Mohawk and Mane and imperceptibly turned his head towards the conversation. If Isabelle knew that Flattop was listening, she probably wouldn't have talked so freely about him. In response to Laheeti's suggestion that Flattop was shy, she turned her head stiffly and stared at Laheeti with zombie eyes, mimicking the way Flattop sometimes stared at her. "Or maybe he's just weird," she replied. Laheeti gave her a friendly shove. "Don't do that, you're freaking me out," he laughed. "I'm just showing you how Flattop looks at me," Isabelle joked. "Don't take it personally, Isabelle," said Gull. "I think he looks at everybody the same way. I've never met anyone like him." "Do you think you can take him?" asked Laheeti. "You mean, in a fight?" asked Gull. Isabelle looked at Laheeti sharply and asked, "Who cares if Gull can beat him in a fight?" "Hey, it's important," explained Laheeti. "Gull is my bodyguard, so I should know if he thinks he can beat Flattop." Gull watched the long, heavy strides of the silver-haired giant and thought for a long moment. "He's pretty big," was all he said. Up ahead, Flattop smiled smugly. "You'd better believe I could take you in a fight, Gulbenkian," he thought to himself. Isabelle giggled. "He's pretty big, but not very pretty," she added. Mohawk and Mane chuckled to themselves. Flattop's smile evaporated, and just then, Isabelle moved up to the #1 spot on his hit list. "Well, I think we all agree that they are a little bit strange," stuttered Gull. "Let's just keep an eye on them, and if you see anything suspicious, come and tell me or Burnmaster." Isabelle and Laheeti nodded. Flattop stopped at the door to the hotel. When he held it open for his companions to enter, he wasn't entirely without social graces. He glanced back down the street coldly. "Thanks for your assessment of me, Gulbenkian," he thought. "While you're keeping an eye on me, I will keep my eye on you. And if I see an opportunity to make you disappear, then I guarantee that these mountains will be the last thing you ever see." Mane looked at his brother as he moved past. "What they said doesn't affect our mission," he stated. "By the time they realize we're not university students from South Korea, we'll have the Yeti tooth and be long gone from here." "Oh, I agree," Flattop replied, nodding conversationally. "It's just talk, that's all." Mane watched his brother's face. "That's right," he replied. The hotel was an old guest house with faded rugs and creaking wooden floors. The building had passed its use-by date long ago but had lost none of its charm. The receptionist spoke some English, so Burnmaster handled the arrangements for checking in. That was fine by Pemba because he was dog-tired and unable to think about anything except a nice soft bed and endless rest. When the 14-year-olds got up to their rooms, they collapsed onto their beds in exhaustion. They had been awake for almost 24 hours straight and had had an amazing near-death experience. The danger had passed from the moment they escaped from the buried bus, but the whole ordeal didn't end until they were curled up in their beds and sleeping soundly. That was the point when the extraordinary events of the previous day became a memory, and the memory became part of their life experience. After checking that the 14-year-olds were secure in their rooms, Burnmaster sat down heavily on the edge of his bed, pulled his muddy hiking boots off one at a time, and dropped them on the wooden floor. He stared down at his blue woolen socks for a few moments, watching his own toes wiggle up and down. It had been a long day, a very long day, and it felt good to take his boots off. After putting Isabelle and the others to bed, he had intended to drop his rucksack in his room and then start looking around Shabrubesie for Nikki Zipster. He had come a long way to find her, and he was worried about her. But the events of the last 24 hours had been more taxing than he thought, and sitting there on the edge of the bed, he felt an overwhelming desire to sleep. His eyelids began to close, and his limbs felt like they were full of sand. Soon his body sagged back onto the bed, and he fell asleep thinking how unfortunate it was that the silver-haired Koreans had decided to stay at the same hotel. In a room down the corridor, Flattop eventually concluded that Burnmaster wasn't going to sneak out and look around Shabrubesie. The giant GX had intended to follow him if that happened, but now it wasn't necessary. That suited Flattop, and when Burnmaster and his companions awoke in a few hours, the GXs would be ready to join their group in the search for Nikki Zipster. He still wasn't convinced that Maine's plan to follow the 14-year-olds around Shabrubesie would work, but he was prepared to try it for a couple of days. Flattop was a dedicated soldier of the North Korean military, and he was prepared to do whatever was necessary to fulfill his mission objectives. And if that meant he had to trail Isabelle, Laheeti and Twig around, he would stick to them like Gray on gunmetal. If Maine's plan yielded results, great. If not, it would be time for a rethink. In the meantime, as the 14-year-olds were sleeping now, Flattop decided to do the same. Mohawk and Maine were already snoring contentedly in their rooms. The old hotel bed creaked in protest when Flattop laid his enormous bulk down on the mattress, and soon he dozed off in his usual manner, with one eye half open, wary, and always watching. Pemba opened the door to his hotel room a crack and peered out. Nobody was moving around in the corridor, and he couldn't hear any conversations coming from the others' rooms. After waiting a few moments longer to be sure, he gently eased his door closed and sat down on the edge of his bed. He was as tired as everybody else, but there was one more thing he needed to do before he went to sleep. Taking out the satellite phone from his pocket, he dialed Zaw's number. Abby answered the phone. "Pemba?" she asked. He kept his voice to a whisper just in case the wooden walls of the hotel were paper thin. "It's me," he replied. "You're not going to believe the day I've had." Abby laughed hollowly and said, "Try me. So you know what happened," he whispered. "We were at the landslide all night trying to work out how to help you," Abby explained. "We were ready to start digging with our bare hands." "Zaw too?" asked Pemba with a chuckle. "Yes, even Zaw," she confirmed. "I'm touched. I didn't know he cared," said Pemba. Zaw, who was walking beside his sister, could hear the conversation. He pointed a warning finger at her, and she gave him a look and said into the phone, "I'll tell you all about it someday." Pemba asked if she had contacted Shangri-La to tell them what happened, and Abby reassured him that she had told everybody he was safe. "So what's your plan now?" she asked. "I'm gonna stick with Burnmaster and his friends while they look for Nikki Zipster," Pemba said. "Where are you now?" Abby asked. "In a hotel in Shabrubesie," whispered Pemba. "Everybody's asleep." Zaw overheard and grumbled. "A hotel, huh?" he muttered. "Ask him if he's comfortable." Abby ignored her brother. "Why are you whispering?" she asked. Pemba's eyes moved to the door. "I don't want the others to hear me talking on the phone," he explained. "The less they know about me, the better, and I don't want them to get suspicious about who I'm talking to." "Amen to that," replied Abby. "So what now? You guys just sit tight until I find out what Burnmaster intends to do," Pemba said. "If he can't find Nikki Zipster here, I've got a feeling he'll head into the mountains to look for her. That's going to make our job of keeping them safe a lot harder," mused Abby. "Tell me about it," agreed Pemba. Zaw glanced up at the icy peaks in the distance. "This is the wrong time of year to be heading into the mountains," he stated expertly. "I know, but we'll cross that crevasse when we come to it," replied Pemba. Abby hoped that Pemba would be able to convince Burnmaster that an expedition into the mountains at this time of year was too dangerous for humans. Then her thoughts returned to the landslide that Pemba had narrowly escaped from. "Who were those three huge guys that pulled the bus out of the landslide?" she asked. "Is that what actually happened?" asked Pemba. "I was in the bus, so I didn't see anything. It was dark, but I'm pretty sure about what I saw," Abby said. "Nobody at Shangri-La believed me, though. I don't know who they are, but they say they're university students from Korea," said Pemba. "They've joined up with Burnmaster's group, so I'm going to see a lot more of them." "They're traveling with you?" Abby asked. "They're at this hotel right now," Pemba replied. "They said they're looking for Nikki Zipster, too. They must have seen the news article about her finding the yeti tooth." Zaw wrapped the tips of his claws on his white teeth and said, Whoever thought these chompers could attract so much attention? Abby ignored her brother. Just watch your back, she cautioned, and if you get into trouble, give us a call. We're not too far away from Shabrubesi. How long will it take you to get here? Asked Pemba. Abby thought for a moment. About 2, maybe 2.5 hours, she replied. And how long if you run? Laughed Pemba. Tell him that isn't funny, snarled Zaw. Then his face brightened and he said, I have a question. When we arrive in Shabrubesi, are you gonna be able to bring us some breakfast? Pemba had to hand it to the Yeti. He never stopped trying. Sorry, dude, you're gonna have to live off the land for a while, he laughed. If I start ducking away from the group, questions are gonna be asked, and I don't want anybody to follow me. Pemba's logic was infallible, but that didn't make Zaw any happier with the answer. Terrific, he grunted.
That is the end of this chapter. To listen to the next chapter on YouTube or to purchase the digital ebook from Amazon, see the links in the description.